April 1945. Southern Kyushu, Japan. In a drafty wooden barracks that smelled of oil, sweat, and moldy straw, a 20-year-old ensign in the Imperial Japanese Navy crouched over a scrap of paper, hands trembling as he wrote words that, if found by his superiors, would have branded him a coward. I was supposed to die at dawn. It is now noon, and I am still here. I was trained to die, not to return. No one has told us how to live if the mission fails. His name in post-war testimonies would be given only as Ensign SS. Outside, the airfield hummed with activity. Ground crew rolled fuel drums. Mechanics cursed at engines as they coaxed life from aircraft that were barely airworthy. Some of the planes had their landing gear removed, extra fuel tanks and bomb racks crudely bolted on. These were not designed to return. They were Atokak aircraft, special attack planes. The Allied navies knew them by a different word that would echo for generations: Kamikaze. By the spring of 1945, Japan's military leaders had run out of rational strategies. Industrial output was collapsing under Allied bombing. The fleet had been shattered. Fuel was scarce. The only resource still plentiful was young men taught from childhood that death for the emperor was the highest good. The mathematics of this decision trading pilots and planes for a chance to damage American warships were not evaluated in cost-benefit charts. They were written instead on the faces of boys like Ensign S, who had been told that their existence would last one more flight. The war did not end for him over an enemy carrier. It would continue, in a different form, long after the propeller stopped turning. The making of a willing weapon. 3 years earlier, in 1942, he had been an eager teenager. He joined the Navy not as a fanatic, but as a boy drawn to the sky like many young men in every air force of that war. Japan's militarized education system had done its work well. Shrines, school rituals, and textbooks taught that the emperor was living God, that Japan's mission was divine. Children memorized stories of warriors who chose death over capture. By the time he entered flight training, phrases like gaokasai, honorable shattered dual death, were as familiar as multiplication tables. But early in the war, pilots were not trained to be bullets. They were trained to fight, win, and return. The shift to deliberate suicide missions came only as the strategic situation collapsed. By late 1944, after defeats in the Marianas and the loss of the Philippines, naval leaders like Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro proposed a desperate idea: crash planes loaded with bombs and fuel directly into Allied ships. Industrial logic said Japan could not match American production. Psychological logic said perhaps Japan could outmatch American willingness to die. Pilot selection reflected that shift. Volunteer calls were written in such a way that saying no was almost unthinkable. At briefings, officers would say, "We seek volunteers for a task of the highest honor. Those who do not wish to volunteer may step back." No one stepped back. Everyone understood that to move one pace behind the line was to move outside the community of the brave, outside the circle of those considered worthy. In memoirs, some men admitted they did not truly want to die. They wanted to belong. They feared shame more than death. Ensign S volunteered in such a meeting. He wrote later, "I lifted my hand because everyone else's hand was in the air. If I had kept my hand down, I would no longer have been myself as I understood that word." From that moment, training changed tone. Training for a death that brooked no return. Special attack training was both mundane and ritualized. On the practical side, pilots learned low-level flight to avoid radar, final approach attacks against ship silhouettes, how to hold a course steady under fire. On the ritual side, they were surrounded by death cult pageantry. Before sorties, they were given senenbarish, belts stitched with 1,000 stitches by women to bring luck. They drank cups of ceremonial sake. They bowed before shrines, signed farewell letters to parents, posed for photographs, smiling in hachimaki headbands emblazoned with rising suns and words like certain death. Officers gave speeches that wrapped the mission in centuries of myth. You are like cherry blossoms, falling at the moment of perfect beauty. Your crash into the enemy will be a shining act for 10,000 years. Cherry blossoms, shining acts, 10,000 years. Each phrase distanced the boys from what they were actually being asked to do, die in burning metal, their bodies atomized against the steel of an American ship. No training manual addressed other outcomes: bad weather, engine failure, navigation errors, a target already sunk before arrival. The doctrine assumed a clean line from takeoff to impact to national glory. Reality was messier. April 1945. The mission that didn't happen. His first scheduled mission came during the Battle of Okinawa, when kamikaze attacks reached their bloody peak. American radar picket ships ringed the island, destroyers whose job was to warn the fleet of incoming raids and absorb the first blows. For pilots like him, those destroyers were both opportunity and death trap. On the morning of his mission, he slipped into his flight gear in silence with others in his unit. Ground crew helped him strap into a Mitsubishi Zero modified for attack, bombs slung under the fuselage, extra fuel, nothing saved for a return. He had written farewell letters the night before, to parents he would never see again, to a younger sister who would be told that he died like a true warrior. He taxied out, heart beating hard but steady. In his cockpit, hanging from a strut, was a small charm from his mother. He did not believe it would save him. He hoped it would make his death cleaner. They took off in formation, climbing toward the south, toward the unseen enemy. The plan was simple: fly low over the ocean to avoid detection. Climb only for the final dive. Choose a ship, any ship, and aim for the flight deck or bridge. As they approached the area where ships should appear on the horizon, low clouds thickened. Radio reports crackled. Enemy fighters spotted. American corsairs dove out of the sun. Tracer fire ripped through the sky. His leader's plane took hits, trailing smoke, then exploded in a blossom of fire over the waves. Another comrade vanished into cloud, last words cut off mid-syllable. He descended, weaving, heart pounding, not with noble resolve but with animal fear. In the chaos, separated from his formation, buffeted by wind and cloud, he realized he no longer knew his exact position. Navigation in a single knee-engine plane over featureless ocean under cloud was never precise. Fuel burned down. He broke below the clouds, scanning for the grey silhouettes of enemy ships. There was only empty sea. Minutes passed. Fuel gauges dropped. He faced a choice no instructor had addressed: crash into water, alone, fulfilling the letter of no return, or turn back toward land, toward a runway that symbolized failure. In those moments, doctrine and instinct wrestled. Doctrine said, die. Instinct said, live. He turned the nose north. He told himself he would try one more time tomorrow. He promised the dead leader in some inner monologue that he wasn't abandoning the mission, only postponing it. But inside he knew, if he landed, he would cross a threshold. He would become something for which his language had no honorable word. Landing alive in a culture of death. He brought the plane down hard on the strip, tires screeching, engine coughing its last. Ground crew stared as he climbed from a kamikaze aircraft that still had its bomb attached. The base commander arrived, face tight. Why have you returned? Weather, separation, clouds, navigation, enemy fighters. He offered all the reasons. None of them mattered as much as the single fact he stood on the ground breathing when he was supposed to be a smear on steel in the East China Sea. In other units, there were documented cases of survivors being beaten, humiliated, even threatened with court-martial. Some were sent out again as soon as possible, pressed to redeem themselves. Others were reassigned, their presence a reminder that the system could misfire. In his case, records would not preserve the details. His later recollection was spare. The commanding officer did not yell. That was worse. He said only, "You have shamed your comrades. Prepare yourself for the next mission." He was sent back to barracks. Men who had laughed with him weeks earlier now avoided his gaze. He had broken the one rule that mattered at that moment in Japan. If ordered to die, you died. The Empire had no use for survivors of suicide missions. History did. But history would only come later. August 1945, ordered to live. As aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots dwindled, many special attack missions were scrubbed before takeoff. In some units, fully trained kamikaze personnel never left the ground. They waited day after day in a suspended state, having said their farewells, eaten their last meals repeatedly, each non-mission deepening the surreal sense that they were already ghosts who simply hadn't caught up with their own deaths. Then, in August, Hiroshima and Nagasaki vanished beneath mushroom clouds. On August 15th, 1945, the Emperor's voice came over the radio, distorted, formal, announcing surrender. For a young man whose life had been shaped by the idea that the Emperor was divine and Japan would never submit, the words were incomprehensible. Senior officers ordered men to line up on the airfield. Some, it is recorded, drew swords and committed ritual suicide rather than live in defeat. Others simply sank down, staring at the ground. The base commander, who had once spoken of Honorable Gyokusai, now read out new orders: stack weapons, preserve equipment, await Allied inspection. In a matter of minutes, death had gone from sacred duty to pointless waste. For Ensign S, the emotional arithmetic shifted violently. If he had died as planned in April, his photograph would now be on a family altar. His photograph would now be on a family altar, his story told as a noble sacrifice. Instead, he stood under a blazing sun, alive in a country that had lost the war. He had been prepared to die for a cause that no longer existed. No one had prepared him to live for nothing. Post-war Japan, a nation of mouths to feed, not heroes to glorify. Demobilization turned warriors into burdens overnight. He traded his flight suit for a shabby civilian jacket, boarded crowded trains heading back to a hometown he had not seen since training. Cities lay in ruins. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, vast areas flattened by firebombing. He walked past blackened foundations, improvised shacks, children with distended bellies. In his parents' neighborhood, houses were patched together from scrap wood and tin. His mother wept when she saw him, not only for joy, but for a more complex grief. "You were supposed to be dead," she said later. "We had already said goodbye in our hearts." His father, a stern man who had supported the war, sat in silence for a long time before speaking. "Do not speak of the mission," he said finally. "The neighbors lost sons who did not return. You lived. Remember that." In early post-war Japan, kamikaze survivors occupied an uneasy place. Allied censors discouraged open glorification of suicide attacks. Former Toko pilots were not hauled before war crimes tribunals. They were too young, too low in rank. But neither were they celebrated. The new Japan, under US occupation, drafting a pacifist constitution, needed democratic citizens, not icons of militarist fanaticism. Publicly, they disappeared into the grey mass of defeated men looking for work. Privately, many wrestled with the knowledge that they had once been willing to turn themselves into human bombs. Work, silence, and the weight of an unspent death. Employers did not line up to hire failed suicide pilots. He had no civilian trade. Aircraft factories were dismantled or repurposed. The Navy no longer existed. He took whatever work he could find, unloading coal, pushing carts. Later, clerk work at a small transport company. At first, he said nothing about his wartime role. When people asked, "What did you do in the war?" he answered vaguely, "I was in the Navy." He was not alone in this. Across Japan, millions of veterans carry private wars inside them, jungle patrols, naval battles, prisoner of war camp duties, civilian massacres. The state had no systematic program for psychological care. Militarist indoctrination was replaced not by therapy, but by a pressing need to eat and rebuild. He worked long hours, queued for rationed rice, saved for shoes that did not leak in the rain. At night, he woke sweating, hearing the roar of engines, seeing again the empty sea and his leader's plane exploding. In dreams, he sometimes completed the dive, felt the stomach-dropping rush toward a grey deck, then woke before impact. In other dreams, he flew endlessly over an ocean with no ships, fuel tanks never emptying, condemned to circle forever in search of a death that would end the search. There was no word in Japanese then for ACT's post-traumatic stress disorders. There was only neurasthenia, or vague complaints about nerves. He did not complain. He had, after all, survived. The dead could not wake from their dreams, family, and the unspeakable past. In the early 1950s, as Japan's economy began its slow climb, he married a woman from a neighboring town. She knew he had been a sailor, but like many women of her generation, she did not ask for details at first. The shared silence of defeat covered many things. When their first son was born, he felt a joy so fierce it frightened him. Holding the baby, he thought, "If I had died as planned, this face would not exist." The thought did not feel purely like gratitude. It felt also like theft from the comrades who had not turned back that day. As his children grew, school textbooks changed. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, new curricula de-emphasized heroism and emphasized the tragedy of war, the suffering of civilians, the new pacifist constitution. His son came home from middle school one day and said, "Father, our teacher told us about kamikaze pilots. They were crazy fanatics, right?" He felt the air thicken. In his mind, he saw again the faces of the boys he had trained with. Not madmen, but teenagers who liked baseball, who worried about acne, who missed their mothers. He wanted to shout. They were not crazy. They were made. Instead, he said carefully, they were young men in a desperate time. Many of them did not want to die, but saw no way to refuse. His son stared. "Were you one of them?" He did not answer fully for years. Shame sat beside him at the dinner table. Shame that he had been willing to die for a militarist lie. Shame that he had not died like those lie demanded. Only decades later, as public attitudes shifted, would he begin to speak more openly. Memory wars in a booming Japan. By the 1960s, Japan was changing faster than anyone in that 1945 barracks could have imagined. Expressways, bullet trains, and factories rose where ruins once stood. The Tokyo Olympics of 1964 showcased a modern, peaceful nation. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, peace museums framed the war as a cautionary tale about nuclear weapons. The kamikaze fit uneasily into this new narrative. On one side, some conservative politicians and writers began to romanticize them again, using them as symbols of pure self-sacrifice lost in a materialistic age. On the other, Left-leaning intellectuals and pacifists condemned them as victims of fascist brainwashing or as embodiments of militarist madness. Neither side had much room for the actual, messy experiences of surviving pilots. He was invited once in the 1970s to speak at a local school. The teacher introduced him as someone who was trained as a kamikaze but never flew his mission. The students asked blunt, adolescent questions. Were you afraid? Did you want to die? Do you regret coming back? He answered as honestly as he could. Yes, I was afraid. No, deep down I did not want to die, though I did not admit that to myself then. Do I regret coming back? When I look at my grandchildren, no. When I think of the faces of my friends who did not, I do. He tried to explain that the most frightening thing was not death itself, but how easy it had been to step into the role prepared for him. The scariest part, he said, is that I was ordinary. If you had been born when I was born, gone to the schools I went to, heard the same speeches, I suspect many of you would have done the same. That is what we must remember if we are to stop it happening again. Some students cried. Others wrote essays. He went home exhausted, but for the first time felt that his survival might have a purpose beyond private guilt. The arithmetic of a life reclaimed. Historians and military analysts have pored over the numbers of the Kamikaze campaign. Roughly 3,800 pilots died in such attacks. Hundreds of Allied ships were damaged or sunk. The cost in planes and trained aviators further crippled Japan's defenses. Strategically, most scholars agree the kamikaze could not change the war's outcome. Industrially, the math was hopeless from the start. For every Japanese plane, the US could build several. For every pilot trained to crash once, the US trained pilots to fly dozens of missions. But there was another arithmetic that did not fit on staff charts, the counterfactual of each man who might have died but did not. Each unexpended pilot meant children born, businesses started, students taught, houses built, things that do not appear in casualty statistics but shape a nation's recovery nonetheless. For decades, he kept the scrap of paper from that day in April 1945 folded in a box. I was supposed to die at dawn. In old age, he added another line below it, I did not. Instead, I have spent a lifetime learning how to be worthy of that failure. The empire that had demanded his death vanished in months. The family that grew from his unwanted survival endured. In the end, the Kamikaze campaign demonstrated the same brutal lesson that Japanese officers had once learned about American Marines in the Pacific. You cannot win a modern war by sacrificing human lives faster than the enemy. In peacetime, the corollary is quieter, but just as clear. A society is not redeemed by how gloriously its young men die, but by how fully they are allowed to live. The boy in the Toko unit never crashed into a ship. He crashed into history instead, into a Japan forced to rethink everything it had taught him. The rest of his life was spent climbing from that wreckage, one ordinary day at a time.